Welcome back to our study on Daniel, Hope for the Faithful. We are in lesson 6 tonight, which is Daniel chapter 5. And we are going to be talking about the story, The Writing on the Wall, or we could call it The King Humbled version 2, because last week we did The King Humbled version 1 with Nebuchadnezzar and his tree chopped down. And we saw that idea of God bringing down the arrogant king. And as we talked about, when we talked about the structure of this section, how it goes 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, with these chapters, we're in a pairing where we're at the two middle pieces where these two chapters have mirrored elements to each other. So we're going to talk about that tonight as we go through chapter 5. Before we do that, let's review chapter 2. We talked about how Nebuchadnezzar was represented in his vision as a tree. What was that tree like, and what did it mean?
The tree was abundant with life and fed everything and protected everything. It went to the sky.
Yep, from the earth, and it touched the heaven. Abundance, fruit, life. Yeah.
It was shade for the animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shade, and the birds nested in its branches. Yes, yeah. It was a providing tree, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so what did that mean?
King Nebuchadnezzar was powerful.
Yeah, he was given to be this providing tree, right? He was God's representative to rule on earth, and he was supposed to be exercising godly dominion, right? To thus share the very life of God, touching heaven and remaining in the earth, the very life of God with the creatures under it. And so we had this tree of life image where he was supposed to be reigning in God's way. Did he reign in God's way?
No.
What did he do instead?
He's a tyrant.
Yeah, we saw him fly into a rage. We saw him executing people. We know from the instructions of the things he was supposed to turn around and start doing that he was not showing mercy to the oppressed, that he was abusing his people, and that he was not righteous. And so the symbol was that the tree was chopped down, and then we get one of those sort of moments in a dream, like you have in a dream, that we're going to see as we go through more visions, where now, because his tree is chopped down, he is, instead of the mind of a man, he has the mind of the beast, and he's driven away to live in the fields and live like a beast. What was the symbolism of him becoming a beast?
He's giving into his emotions and all the things that we talk about being sins, all the anger and things that are not of love.
Yeah, we see those beastly behaviors of being uncontrolled, maybe driven by instinct and not by a concern or image of God kind of behaviors, dominion, rationality, caretaking, right? He's driven by urges, right? Not held back. And so what we see in that symbolism is that when human beings exercise dominion, but apart from the way of God, in an ungodly way, it makes them like beasts. And we see that, right? When rulers rule badly, it's like becoming beasts. And that image of the beast is going to continue to show up. And in fact, in 2 chapters, we're going to see Daniel's dream, parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's dream with the 4 metals in the statue. Daniel's dream of the 4 beasts that are kingdoms, right? So this image sort of will continue to run through Daniel, and we'll watch for that, right? So as we, did last week's lesson, we ended with this idea that, this tree image appears over and over in Scripture. We have the choice presented as is presented in Psalm 1, all the way through scripture, and the way it's in Psalm 1 is don't be like the sinners, the scoffers, the mockers, but be like the good tree. It's follow God's way, choose wisdom, and you'll be like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. So healthy and fruitful and able to bless others is the way of wisdom. It's what happens when we follow God's way. And we saw Jesus speak to this same image. He says, when you have you may be like the kingdom of God is like a tiny mustard seed, so small, but when it grows, it becomes branches that the birds can nest in. And Jesus quoted this line that's in Daniel, it's in Ezekiel, it's in Psalm. Psalm 104, I think. And that's in our notes from last time. I don't remember the psalm. This idea that when we choose God's way, he multiplies the blessing that we're able to do. And so that we become this abundant source of abundance for those around us. Anyone have any other thoughts or, just anything that's been on your mind from last week's lesson?
I just made an interesting connection between you're talking about the thread of the tree throughout this being wisdom, and where did we get in trouble in the first place? The tree of
the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. So, or good and bad, so in some ways those words are just like distinguishing what's good for you and what's bad for you. The tree metaphor sometimes represents how God is providing the abundance of life, but there's always the opportunity to turn away from it and to try to do things not God's way. Yeah, great point. Other thoughts or anything you wanted to discuss from last week? Well, let's read tonight. We're going to start in Daniel 5, 1 through 4. So would someone read just those first 4 verses?
I'll read them.
Thank you.
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the thousands. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of the gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone.
Thank you. Okay, so who's king now?
Belshazzar.
Okay, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? What was the end of his reign? Well, who were the kings in between? Right, we have jumped quite a distance in history, in Babylonian history, and we didn't get any historical sort of thread that ran through, did we? We have seen over and over again that communicating the history of this time period is not the priority of our author, right? And so they did not tell us what happened at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign or all the kings in between. But we have this chart from a few lessons ago, and it's on the Daniel study page, and I'll put this back, this listing of kings back on this one as well. But for now, I'm going to just sort of put up, I should have made like, a slide or something, but instead I'm just going to share my notes here. So this is just my notes I made from to put on the board when I have a whiteboard, but it occurs to me that I don't have, like a physical whiteboard to write on. And so instead of copying this into the whiteboard, I'm just going to show you my notes. So what we have is we have King Nebuchadnezzar that we have been seeing from chapter 1 all the way through the end of chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar was still reigning, right? He was reinstated and reigning again, and now suddenly it's Belshazzar. Well, from what we know of Babylonian history, what happened after Nebuchadnezzar is his son Amel-Marduk, or this is another way to say that is Evil-Merodach, who shows up in Second Kings. His son reigned, and then there was a coup, and Nebuchadnezzar reigned for some years. What's that? 4 years, I guess. And then his son reigned, and another coup, and Nabonidus reigned. Nabonidus was technically the last king of Babylon. He was king until 539 BC. So you see, we're, from 605 to 539, like it's not that long when you consider that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a regent kings, 5.5 kings. So, but it's long enough that Daniel is not a young man anymore, right? This has kind of spanned over a longer part of his life. Nabonidus was an unpopular king. He didn't focus on Marduk, or another name for Marduk, Bel, but a moon god. And because of that, he was not well liked, and he ended up like absconding to a desert oasis, Temia, for 10 years. And during this time, the festivals to Marduk that required the king's presence, the yearly festivals, could not be celebrated. And so some of the records talk about the Babylonian people being highly, highly disgruntled with Nabonidus. His approval rating was not good. And during the time that he was away in Temia, he left his son Belshazzar, who is not called king in Babylonian records because Nabonidus is still alive and is the king of record. But Belshazzar is there as a regent, and he ruled in his father's place in Babylon in the city for the last 10 years. And then what history tells us, in 539 BC, Cyrus the Persian attacked during the night of a drunken festival. And the Persian records, now we remember when history is written by the winners, then, sometimes we have to take some of this with a grain of salt, right? But they say that the Babylonians didn't even mount a defense, that the Persians were able to take the city without a fight because they trusted in their walls, and so they weren't worried about the attackers outside the walls. But the Persians diverted the Euphrates and came in under the wall, and so they were able to take the city without mass destruction. And because to hear the Persians tell it, the Babylonians were so fed up with Nabonidus that they'd rather have Cyrus as their king. For what written by the Persians. So for what it's worth. Anyway, that's the history we have of this period. So what we have is a king Belshazzar. Now, is Belshazzar Nebuchadnezzar's son? Is he even his blood descendant? Shouldn't be. I mean, maybe there's some relative on his mother's side kind of, situation that we don't know about, but no records say that he is Nebuchadnezzar's son. Is he even really the king? No, but it's kind of normal to call the person ruling in a city the king, right? Because he's kind of king in action, if not in name, right? He is regent. He is ruling. And so what we have to ask is, what is happening here with this story? Why does the story keep calling him Nebuchadnezzar's son. And you notice if you did this reading ahead of time, does it mention it just once? We'll highlight this as we go, but it's kind of emphasized. It keeps emphasizing Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king Nebuchadnezzar, you the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, what's going on with that? Why are we calling Nebuchadnezzar his father when Nebuchadnezzar is not literally his father?
Just like
Same kingdom, perhaps. Even though they changed dynasties through usurpation, it was still the Babylonian kingdom. So it was Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom.
Okay. Yeah. So in sort of a symbolic way. Yeah. What were you going to say, Amy?
just like we call Jesus the son of David.
Okay, Jesus. So this is a good point. So Jesus is the son of David, but then we go through. Well, then we go look at the genealogy, and then go, is that through Joseph's side? Because did he have any of Joseph genes? Because or maybe that's through Mary's side as well, or and so. I think y'all are onto the thing that I think is true. There's a couple of possibilities here. One possibility, and the thing that you've said is what I think is most likely. The one possibility is that the previous story, the one where Nebuchadnezzar is absent from his kingdom for a number of times and half a time, so maybe years, was maybe originally about Nabonidus, whose name I have trouble saying. And because of that, Belshazzar is literally the son of Nabonidus, and it used to be about that story. And it was made about Nebuchadnezzar because the flow of the literary, we've been following Nebuchadnezzar all this time. Okay, one possibility. A second possibility, but that would just be speculation, right? We don't have any evidence that says that story was originally about Nabonidus. It's a speculation. Nabonidus was absent from his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar disappeared in this story. Okay. Another possibility is that this just doesn't matter to the author. The author is much more about his theological and symbolic points than he is about getting the historical details right. And he's just like, okay, but you guys get the point, right? So maybe, but he mentions it a lot of times. So I think what you're saying is right, is that the author is calling Belshazzar Nebuchadnezzar's son in the sense of his successor and the follower of his ways. He is Nebuchadnezzar's son in terms of kingly arrogance. And it comes out in this story. And so when we have all the tiebacks to the Nebuchadnezzar story, it's sort of, saying like, you're just like him. Yes, there's a series succession in between. There's some coups or these usurpations, but you're the follower of his ways, sitting on his throne. And it's just more of the same. So we're getting a theological point here. And all of these are consistent with the way that our genre, apocalyptic literature, works. So it does make sense. Questions or comments on that? And then you also have you do have some scholars who really try hard to figure out how Belshazzar might have been a son or at least a descendant literally of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's, archaeology is ongoing. We're always discovering new things, and we may discover something that makes that turn out to be true. So a possibility as well. No evidence yet, but it could appear. All right. And what is Belshazzar up to?
Blasphemy.
Yes, blasphemy. What is the context of his blasphemy? What's the setting?
He is spitting in God's way every way he can, taking all the treasures and feasting and drinking with them.
Okay, he throws a great feast And what is the feast like?
Large. And they're drinking to his gods.
Yeah. Okay, so it's big. He has 1,000 nobles. So we get the sense that it is grand and extravagant. And then who else does he have there?
His wives, concubines,
Right. So having a
lords.
bunch of wives and concubines represents political power and self-indulgence, right?
Mhm.
He's got power because he's got wives accrued from all of these. He's made. Usually, wives are a way of cementing alliances, and then concubines are a way of indulging. So he's got his harem. He's got the whole harem there, and it sounds drunken, doesn't it? It doesn't tell us it's drunken, but there seems to be a great emphasis on the wine. So it seems like maybe it's a drunken feast, and it's religious in the way of praising these gods. Yeah, yeah. So they bring in, you mentioned, these gold and silver temple vessels. Where did we last hear about the temple vessels?
When they were ransacked by Nebuchadnezzar out of God's temple.
Yeah, way back on page 1 of Daniel, right? We get that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken them from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And we get that information repeated here, right? Tying back, those two are tied together by this information about the vessels. And then he decides to drink from them. So what were these vessels? What were they supposed to be for, and what did they mean? Is a question I want to ask of this text, right? Because the original readers of this work, I think, would have had some instinctive and emotional understanding of temple vessels that we maybe do not have, right? We're not used to this. We don't know what these are. So let's turn over and read a passage about them. This is one of 3 that are almost exactly the same. Let's go to Exodus 25. And see what we I was just thinking I should have marked that, and then I turned right to it. Exodus 25, and we're going to look at the section. This is starting in verse 23, the table, or the table of the, what do you guys have?
Acacia wood.
Oh, yes, acacia wood. What about the section header? What does it call it?
Oh, table for bread.
Table for bread. Anyone have anything different?
The table.
The table. The old NIV has just the table. Many translations will call this the table of the showbread. So we'll talk more about this bread, the table of the bread, the table of the showbread. Okay, someone read for us 23 through 30, please.
I will.
Thank you.
Make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, a cubit wide, and a cubit and a half high. Overlay it with pure gold and make a gold molding around it. Also make around it a rim a handbreadth wide and put a gold molding on the rim. Make 4 gold rings for the table and fasten them to the 4 corners where the 4 legs are. The rings are to be close to the rim to hold the poles used in carrying the table. Make the poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold, and carry the table with them. And make its plates and dishes of pure gold, as well as its pitchers and bowls for the pouring out of offerings. Put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times.
Okay, thank you. All right, so when God gave instructions for the tabernacle, okay, the tabernacle was a mobile tent temple, right? It's a tent-based house of God. He also said to make this table of this table of the showbread, or table of the bread of the presence. And okay, y'all, you just read that section of the table of the showbread. Let me read you. I'm going to jump back up to verse 10 in the same chapter. Have them make a chest of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long and a cubit and a half wide. Overlay it with pure gold, both inside and out. Make a gold molding around it. Cast 4 gold rings for them and fasten them to its 4 feet with 2 rings on one side and 2 rings on the other. And make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. And it's okay. What are you noticing here?
It's the same fabrication.
Same, right? This is the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant was made in all these same ways that the table of the showbread was made. And the Ark was a place, was to be in the most holy place. So when they construct the temple, this is a model that shows up a sort of a model of the cosmos that has God at like concentric rings with God at the center is at the design of the temple. Okay, so you get this same design in Eden, where there's Eden and then there's a Garden of Eden, and in the center of the garden is the tree of life, right? You get in the tabernacle, there's the courtyard area and the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and inside the Holy of Holies you have the Ark of the Covenant. And so this idea is like it's concentric with you coming closer and closer to the very presence of God. And the ark is made with 2 cherubim that are on the top is called a seat. Why would it be called a seat? Because this is made like a throne, right? And these cherubim are on either side of the seat. They sit on the seat and their wings face so that God is thought it's like a throne of God. Ancient Near East thrones were over and over again, the ones that have been excavated and are found to be made with divine beings and angelic type beings that are combination creatures, right? A cherubim is a combination creature. It is a winged lion angel, right? It's a what do you call that when like a hybrid or something, it's not a centaur, it's a cherubim, it's a winged angel lion. And so thrones were always all this says to the ancient Near East mind, throne sounds like a throne to me. The ark is like a throne, right? And it's in the most holy place, and it's the presence of God. And then you come out one level to the holy place, and this is where the table of the showbread would be placed. And it would have the bread of the presence on it. The priest would place, it mentions the bread of the presence in verse 30, put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times. And then in other passages, we get more detail about this. There would be 12 plates and a loaf on every plate, one for each of the tribes. And when so the bread is placed in the presence of the Lord to show the presence of the Lord. And when the time is done, the priests take it and they put fresh bread out. Well, what happens to the bread they take up? Any guesses?
They eat it.
They
portion
eat
of it.
it.
Yeah.
Yes, this is food for the priests. The priests eat it. So the bread is a holy offering to God. It's God's food. But as God's food, it gets eaten by God's people, right? It was a sign that God's presence was with the people, that God provided for all their needs in his power and goodness, but also that God was with them directly, as if at the table in their midst, right? So the table it has the bread that they would eat, the bread that shows that God is really there and really with them. And then what other items are there made to go with the table? Verse 29. We have those plates, and then what else?
The plates and dishes of pure gold and pitchers and bowls. for pouring
Okay,
out.
jars, dishes, pitchers, bowls. What are they for?
Offerings.
Offerings. These would be to it says to pour for the pouring out of offerings. These would be for drink offerings. Um, drink offerings were uh, a, a measure of wine, it would be like a certain amount, that was poured out with another offering. So, like we have instructions in other passages, when a lamb is offered, a certain measure of wine is poured out. When a larger item, a ram is offered, a larger amount of wine is poured out. So, I'll read you one of them. This is Leviticus 23, beginning in verse 9. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land which I am going to give you and reap its harvest. So you notice, like, this is going to begin when the people are in their inheritance, when they're in the promised land, where they've received the blessing and it's bearing fruit back for them, and they take a harvest from it, right? Verse 10, then you shall bring in the sheaf of the first fruits from your harvest. So like a handful of actual grain, right? The sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord for you to be accepted. And on that day, the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day you wave the sheep, you shall offer a male lamb 1 year old without defect for a burnt offering to the Lord, and its grain offering. Look, you notice they've got all the food groups, right? All the categories, right? Its grain offering shall then be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil. Got your fat in there, right? An offering by fire to the Lord for a soothing aroma, with its drink offering, 1/4 of a hin, which is just under a quart of wine, right? For us, that'd be like a bottle of wine, right? With its drink offering, 1/4 of a hin of wine. So the drink offering is this cup of wine poured out before the Lord in the land of their rest, in the place where they would be. So the Babylonian court is partying, right? I like Bethany says, like, he's just spitting in God's eye here. They're partying using the vessels that were to show that they were in the land of the promise, in the presence of the Lord, right? They would pour out drink offerings to the Lord in the promised land. So we'll see what God thinks of that. But before we leave our Exodus passage, someone read for me verse 31.
What chapter was that?
Oh, Exodus 25, if you're still there. Otherwise, I'll read it.
Yeah, I've gone to Leviticus. 25:31.
Yes.
Then you shall make a lampstand of pure gold. The lampstand and its base and its staff are to be made of hammered wood. Its cups, its bulbs, and its flowers shall be of one piece with it.
Okay, so the next thing they mentioned is the lampstand. This always happens in all these passages where they talk about the bread of the presence. The next thing they say is make a lampstand. Make it of pure gold, hammer it out, base and shaft. Its flower-like cups, buds and blossoms shall be of one piece. So it starts talking about, what does it look like? What is a lampstand made to resemble?
Plants.
Yeah, it has branches
Yeah,
and
like
flowers. Someone
Like a-
I
like
Like a
tree.
menorah?
so I don't know if it was in a plane like that, or if it was made um you know crisscross, like how a menorah is done all, and I don't know if it was like that. But yes, this comes from the same tradition, absolutely. And the menorah comes from a story of the Maccabees, which happens in probably the era of
Oh,
yeah, like that, and that one is like a menorah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Aaron's rod.
you'll notice verse 33, the cups are shaped like almond flowers with buds and blossoms are to be on a branch. So everything resembles almond tree, right? We're back to the tree motif. We remember that Aaron's staff that miraculously budded and bloomed and produced almonds to show that Aaron had been chosen by God as priest in Numbers. That was one of the holy items that was put in the ark, right? And it was made of almond tree. We say almond wood, they would have said almond tree. So the lampstand is like a tree complete with branches that gives light. And it would have been the reason that it's mentioned right after the showbread table all the time is because it would have been opposite the showbread table. It's a tent, right? With concentric area. It doesn't have windows. So this is the only light that would show the showbread, that would show the presence of God. This is the tree that gives light on the bread, the symbol of the presence. So we're seeing that combination of sort of a complex of metaphors that continue to show up in scripture, and we see them again in Daniel, right? Okay, so we've talked about the drink offering, we've talked about the lampstand. Let's go back to Daniel 5 and see what happens next. Someone read verses 5 through 12, please.
Suddenly the finger of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of a hand, and he did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began to knock together. The king called aloud to bring the conjurers and the Chaldeans and the wise man of Babylon, and any man who could read the inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have the authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then the king's wise men came, but they could not read the inscription or make known the interpretation to the king. Then the king, Belshazzar, was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because the word of the kingdom and the king and his nobles and the queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There's a man in your kingdom whom has the spirit of the holy gods. And the days of your fathers, elimination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because the extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas of dreams, and explanations, and solving difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will be able to declare the interpretation.
Thank you. Okay, so verse 5, what happens?
Spooky hand shows up and writes on the wall.
Right? It's and they do find it spooky, don't they? Yeah. What is it writing with?
His finger.
Right? It's the finger is writing. What does this remind us of?
A sci-fi movie.
Right? I found some art installations. I have a picture I'm going to show at the end that it reminded me of because Aaron's husband Mark travels a lot, and he had posted this picture of this giant gold foot, like this weird, like bulbous looking gold foot, like coming out of a building. And it reminded me that there's a bunch of art installations that involve sculptures of huge hands. And so I started looking at pictures of huge hands. We don't know that this hand was huge, but I think of it as huge. I don't know. It doesn't say. So presumably this hand represents the hand of God. And so we're writing with the finger of God, right? What else was written with the finger of God?
The Ten Commandments.
Yes. Yeah. The 2 tablets with the 10 words or 10 commandments that began the law were written by the finger of God, right? And so we have sort of these acts of power that tell the truth about who God is and the way people should live in response to God's nature, so it's, we're drawing on that history. And we have a location identifier. This happened where's the inscription? Near the
lampstand.
Near the lampstand, right? That's what's shining light on this presence of God. People can see the inscription because it's lit up, but the symbolism is like it, the lampstand goes with the vessels and the table. So, the lampstand is showing God's presence now in a different way. Do I think this is the lampstand that was from the temple? I don't think it's saying that. I just think there's kind of like this story is being sure to pick up on all the little pieces of that identify the elements of God's presence and the holy articles, and. So how does the king take it?
One other time when God wrote, Jesus wrote on the sand.
Mm-hmm.
At one point.
Yeah.
No telling what he wrote, but he wrote on the sand.
Yeah. That's interesting. The Tuesday morning class thought of that as well. And I have been thinking about it, and I want to think more about how that might tie together. I think I'll have to meditate on it. That's a good one. How does the king take it?
Well,
What'd you say, Becky?
his face turned pale, like white as a sheet.
Yeah, this literally says, it doesn't say face, it says his splendor. So his splendor grew pale. And I think it's an idiom like, his "aren't I an awesome king" face completely faded, right? He was wearing his splendor on his face, and it has faded. It's gone white as a sheet, as if he's seen a ghost. Is the idiom we have heard of. And so, very, very interesting. Yeah, his splendor grew pale. That same idiom shows up several, like later his splendor grows paler, and later the queen says, "Don't let your splendor be so pale." So yeah, it keeps picking up on that. What else?
His knees are knocking.
His knees are knocking. It's literally this. Yesterday somebody had a translation that says his knees smote one another. There was smiting of knees. Okay, what else?
Hip joints went slack.
Okay, this is literally, it says the knots, like a rope, like a tide, like a knot. The knots of his hips loosened. It's a weird expression. We think it means his legs went slack. It could mean his bowels were loosed, right? It actually, some have speculated that that's what the idiom means, but it is also setting up a wordplay later. So take note of it, and we'll get there, right? His hip joints loosened, and his thoughts alarmed him, right? It's a vivid way to put it, and it echoes several passages. This idea that alarm is coming onto people happens over and over in Daniel. In 225, Arioch in alarm brings Daniel, or in haste. The form of the verb is different, so it really, in haste is a translation, but it's the same root. brings Daniel to the king's presence. In 324, Nebuchadnezzar leaps up in alarm when he sees the fourth person in the furnace, right? In chapter 4, he reports that his dreams are alarming him. And then in chapter 4, later, Daniel's understanding of the dream and the fact that he's going to have to tell it to the king who flies into a rage, that alarms him. And then we'll see it again. It shows up again later in this chapter 5, and then it shows up again later. I think it's in 7. We'll see it again. So, when God intervenes, it's alarming, right? There is a high, the stakes have been raised when God is coming into the room and exercising power, right? His legs give way, his knees knock together. And what does the king do in verse 7?
Asks for anybody who might possibly be able to help explain what's going on.
Yep. Who does he call? He wants anybody who can help, and who does he pick?
Conjurers, Chaldeans, and the diviners.
It's interesting, if he's not the king, he offers the third position, which would be right below him if he
Yes, yeah.
still.
So it's thought that this may be sort of a element of his kingship, where he's really a regent, where really the king is king and he's second in command because he's really a regent and not a king. And so the position that he offers is next in line, third in line. Yeah.
Which is,
but that word is sometimes also used to mean just a very high official. So, it could be either way. Yeah, he calls in the magicians, and it's the same thing we keep seeing, isn't it? Isn't this so repetitive with our previous chapters? They always call the magicians, and the magicians can never figure it out, right? But notice that the first thing the king wants them to do is just read the inscription, right? There are words written on the wall. Why can't they read it?
Because
it's not in their language.
Okay, is it in their language? That's one question. What'd you say, Bethany?
I said because it's God's language.
Okay. So when Daniel reads it, he reads it in Aramaic. The words he says it says are in Aramaic. So if possibly it's not, and he says what it says, it's something else, and he says it in Aramaic. But even if it is in Aramaic, there could be a couple reasons why they can't read it. One in this period, Aramaic is written, as was Hebrew, without the vowels. So you really just get the consonants, and you're supposed to know and fill in the vowels your own self. And you imagine if a word is written without the consonants, without the vowels, a lot of times you can figure it out, especially if it's a phrase where you kind of could expect it. But this seems to be more like random words. And so the words, which we later learn in 25, why would those words be a phrase? They're not a phrase. So it may be that they just can't figure out what those words are supposed to be because it's a bunch of letters that don't make a phrase. I had like a whole example that we could figure this out with some English words, but I'm not going to do it because we're so short on time. But if the words turn out to mean mina, which is a large unit of money, mina, shekel, a tiny unit of money, and then a half mina, so half of this big unit of money. So these three words, four words, but three different words. If you were to read something like mina, shekel, half mina, you'd be like, is that really the word? Am I filling in the right vowels? Because what does that mean? Right? So they can't even read it, maybe because they don't know what the vowels are, or maybe it was written in some cryptic way. It could even have been written up and down, so they don't, and it's three words with 3 letters each, and so they don't know to read it up and down or sideways, right? So that is possible. Okay, so who comes in to provide some wise counsel in verse 10?
One of the wives.
Okay, one of the wives, you say, and what does the text say? Who came in? Does it say wife?
It says the queen.
Queen.
Oh,
The queen. The wives were already there drinking. So who is this person
the
that comes
mother.
in? The mother, exactly. This is probably the queen mother. If you're in the NIV, you probably have a text note that says or queen mother. Same word is used to indicate queen or queen mother. And the queen mother was a more powerful role in the ancient Near East, much more like a queen in honor authority than the queen's wives would be. Right. So as we're thinking of someone with authority, to speak, and she speaks with wisdom and experience. You notice she's given history, right? This is probably the queen mother, and she comes in saying, don't let your splendor be paled. We can call someone from your fathers. Notice how she emphasizes that relationship. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say. And so she's giving the history from this number of years ago to say there is someone in whom is a spirit of the holy. She probably means gods. That word, to the hearer, to the original hearer, they could think, but I know it's the spirit of the holy God. Same word, different meaning. So we have that kind of dramatic irony where the reader knows more than the speaker, right? Call Daniel, she says. All right, verse 13. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? He'd be more aged now, right? I have heard that a spirit of the gods, you're thinking, spirit of the God, is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing. Same, couldn't do it, right? They could not explain it. Verse 16. Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and loosen knots, solve knotty problems, like the hips of the joints of his, or knots of his hips, were loosened in fear, but Daniel can loosen knotty problems. Knotty, naughty problems, right? So it's a play on words. It's the same phrase, so the queen used it as well. And he offers rewards, right? He's got rewards planned. And Daniel answered the king, I don't need your rewards. Although, in the end, he gets them. Maybe he didn't have a choice. Verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor, right? We know God gave Nebuchadnezzar those things. He was the tree. Because of the high position God gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language, notice how that echoes the story in front of the statue. All the people, nations of every language are going to bow down before the statue when they hear the flute, and echoes that. So many echoes of the previous chapters, right? They're all connected. Dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, to put up, set up, he set up. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. Same word as the last verse of chapter 4. Those who walk in pride, God is able to humble, right? But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed. Same word as in chapter 2, when it said God sets up kings and deposes them. And stripped of his glory, he was driven away from people and given the mind of a beast. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven. Same phrase, right? Echoed. Until he acknowledged the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. This is our theme, right? We're back to this is the theme of Daniel, and sets over them anyone he wishes. Daniel does not try to hide its themes, does it? Right? It's all just right there in the open, and it repeats it a lot. But you, his son in behavior, son in position, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. You had a chance to follow God in God's way. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his house brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, you drank wine from them, and you praised the gods of silver, of gold, of bronze, of iron, of wood, and stone. Created things. A long list, an array of created things rather than the creator, right? Which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. The inscription was written Mene, Mene, or Mina, Mina, Tekel, or Shekel, Parson, or half Mina, right? When he says the inscription, he says them as nouns, right? These are like coin, it's like units, nouns. And then when he gives the interpretation, he takes those same roots and makes them into verbs using different vowels. So mene is the word for, can be made the verb for numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. So he's making sense of this noun that otherwise wouldn't have made sense. It's a mina, but what that means is your days have been numbered. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Weighed is the verb that comes from the same consonants that make the word tekel, which we would normally think of as shekel, a unit of weight. And then peres, or half mina, divided. It means divided. So your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So Belshazzar gives him the rewards, right? That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Okay, we don't have time. We're going to talk about Darius next week because that's a whole nother puzzle, especially with the history. So I'm going to put that off to next week. But we see that Daniel has laid it out, right? He gives the words and the interpretation. His insight from God has provided this reading, which might seem like random words before the interpretation, but the interpretation is the judgment on Belshazzar. Comments or questions on that?
That would
He
have been
says you
scary.
knew. What's
That would have
that?
That would have been scary for
Yeah.
Daniel to have to tell him that.
Yeah. Belshazzar was right to be frightened, and probably Daniel was alarmed to say so, but he doesn't, I don't know. Daniel seems he's pretty mature now, isn't he? Maybe he's too old to be scared of kings anymore.
He knows that this is his last night.
This is his last night. Yeah.
He also knows he's been in this situation before with terrible kings and nothing has happened to him.
Right.
Except he gets raised up to a higher position.
Right. It's going to happen on God's, according to God's plan. And he has been convinced of that. He started out with faith and he's lived it in actuality as well. Yeah. What did it mean? Daniel really emphasized the use of these cups. What do you think it meant for Belshazzar to use the vessels the way he did?
They were to be used by God. So he has basically declared himself God.
Yeah, he's put himself up with God by offering to himself what should have been given to God.
Yeah, it's the whole Tower of Babylon again.
It is. It's on his own terms, right? And making a name for himself, indulging, in front of all the 1,000 nobles and the wives and right? He's making a name for himself, indulging himself, treating what is sacred as a way to make himself be promoted, be raised up. Yeah. And praising the creation with praise that belongs to the Creator. Yeah. He's any other comments or questions? I have some closing remarks. I know we're running low on time.
So my
I don't-
version of the Bible doesn't refer to him as a son, but it says like your predecessor.
It's struggling with the historical the discrepancy between the historical situation and trying to make a faithful translation. It's a word for son, but it could be used as descendant. And so it isn't just quite so simple as we should always translate the word for son, son, but it is just the word for son, So yeah, I mean it's right to struggle with that because it is a struggle in this passage. Yeah. But it's the word for son or descendant, literally. I found this lesson so timely this week. We have a leader who is treating the Most High God, the Lord of Heaven, as if he doesn't matter, as if right and wrong don't matter, as if anyone who has the power can just take the honor for themselves. And that's just not true. And God will eventually show that it's not true. That we see in the way that this ties into the history, we see that, this is the very God who brought the people into the land and took them out again. The drink offering was supposed to be the drink of God, symbolically, to drink with them in their promise, in their inheritance, the land of milk and honey. The drink was the bread of the presence, was the food to show that God was with them, that God spread a table before them, and that God was at the table with them. And so we see a vision of the bread and the wine and God with them in the kingdom, right? That should tell us of God's promises and how God keeps his promises and of God's greatness and his love for us. And God would not allow the wine that he should be poured out to him to show that he was with his people to be used to aggrandize the self, in a arrogant king, right? He wouldn't allow it to be used to show that a king could ignore God's kingdom and set himself up against God. He's a king, an autocrat, a president, a leader, a parent, a teacher, anyone with a dominion, and we all have our dominions as God's representative, and we must use that power to exercise dominion in God's way to do it well, right? So we see themes of Daniel, right? Kings rise up in arrogance and violence and self-indulgence, and they get away with it for a time, but they never get away with it forever. God brings justice, and he will eventually bring the behavior of all those kings, autocrats, from the greatest to the least. He will eventually bring it back into line with the reality that God is sovereign and that his sovereignty is good. It's a blessing. It's a beautiful tree that gives life and gives it in abundance, right? So we see that in God's way, we honor God. God is present with us. He's the bread and the wine of the table. And we see that all the way through, that metaphor runs all the way through to Jesus at the table to tell us that our God is a God who will give up heaven to be with us, who will be made in human likeness to redeem humanity, who will suffer and die with us to rescue us from evil. And in that, we see that God will defeat evil, whether it's an ancient king or a current autocrat, leader, whatever you want to call that person, right? Dictator, all the way from the greatest to the least, God will do that. And that, for our own selves, God will defeat the evil even in our own hearts. It's the first day of Lent today. So today we say, how do I prepare to think about the death and resurrection of my Lord? What is the evil in my heart that I need God to defeat? And the goodness of this image of tree comes back to us, right? Because God can take out the evil and not take out us. You know, he doesn't, he can end the bad without ending me. He can even save me in the process, make me into the tree that blesses others, healthy and fruitful. And so God's judgment is good. God's provision is good. The, the wine and the bread that show his presence are good. Thanks be to God. Thank you all for your great discussion tonight, and for continuing to think about Daniel with me. Next week, we will be in chapter 6. So we'll be in the lion's pit. That's the parallel story to which one?
Daniel and the lions.
Yeah, Daniel and the lion's den, but the parallel is
The furnace.
the
furnace.
three friends in the furnace, right? Those are and we'll look at those as partners, and continue to see that once we really find these themes, that Daniel gets very repetitive, but it's good because it keeps telling us the truth over and over. Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recorder so we can do prayer time.